Spanning the globe to bring you the constant variety of art. It's the Tenet Podcast. I'm Todd Pearson, coming to you from the 40 West Arts District in Lakewood, Colorado, and joining me from his home studio on the Road of Enchantment in Rapid City, South Dakota, my partner, my co-host and friend, Wes Brown.
Oh my God, Todd, it's been a day or two. How you been, my friend? Oh my God.
I'm doing excellent. It's good to see your face.
It's good to see yours.
Super excited to be doing an interview this week.
Yeah.
We have a wonderful guest. Have you been out and about in your area, seeing any shows or?
I try to go to the Dahl Fine Arts Center, and I run into Mark Zimmerman every now and then. So I'm always checking what he's doing. And Tonette and I spent a day with him and his wife out at their little ranch area, and that was a blast. But I try to get out, but we don't leave town much, so it's whatever Rapid offers is what I get.
Yeah, I hear you, man. That's cool that you got to hang out with Mark.
Yeah.
It was such a phenomenal artist.
Yeah. It's such a great guy. Great
right?
guy. Yeah.
I got down to Trinidad first Friday.
Nice.
And went to the A.R. Mitchell. And our good friend Cody Keel had a wonderful show that he curated down there. It's called Character and Context, and it runs through the end of July. But he has all these world-class illustrators as part of the show. And I think it looked like every single one of them must have shown up that night for that particular opening. Just quality work. And then, of course, his own gallery down there that he has inside of the museum there. And so he had his regular community gallery full of people that you would recognize. And then our friends Emily O'Deal and Ken Chapin had this huge, right when you walk in, this beautiful textile installation called Stampede. I'll have to share some pictures with you.
Yeah, I'd love to see it.
Yeah,
I've seen some stuff on Instagram, and so yeah, it was kind of nice to see that he's still going strong. So
yeah, they have some cool stuff in the works, including bringing Goodnight Moon up to Denver. So that whole thing is in the works. 2 shows next year. Super excited, or actually 1 this year and 1 next year. So super excited that Goodnight Moon will be on display once again. And they're starting to get some traction with that. So
that's good. That was a fun interview. I had
yeah.
with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, we are always talking about Trinidad, but seriously, folks, if you haven't experienced it, load up the family and point the car south and go check out what Trinidad has to offer. It's a great little town, and the A.R. Mitchell is a gem of a museum, and we're lucky to have it. All right. You ready to talk some art?
Let's do it.
All right. Our interview this week is a couple years in the making. We were originally made aware of our next guest's work via Brian Kearney at the Hunterton Art Museum in Clinton, New Jersey. So shout out to Brian. Over the years, he's shared with us the work of a handful of stellar artists, and tonight is no exception. But due to various life occurrences, it's kind of taken us a little while to get our next guest. That said, our guest this week is Monica Ong. You can check out her beautiful work at our website, monicaong.com, and you can follow her on Instagram at Proxima Vera. Monica, welcome to the program.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We're excited too to have you. I've been perusing your stuff today and I'm blown away. So yeah, I'm excited. So thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much.
Hey, I want to start off, and we do this a lot, by asking you to take a moment and talk a little bit about yourself, where you're from, where you reside, and then talk about the kind of work that you make.
So I am a Midwestern transplant who is now based in Connecticut. I originally grew up in the Chicago area. And actually, if you recall the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off,
yeah.
Right? Remember that scene where they like escape from the high school and jump into the convertible? That was actually my high school. And I actually learned how to drive like on that Kirby Street. That was where I did like my driver's ed classes. So it's this little suburb called Northbrook, which is just north of Chicago. You know, I grew up there. But I, came out east to do my MFA in art at Rhode Island School of Design. I definitely came to the work I make now from an art school background, which definitely gave me that foundation for a very studio-based approach to writing. Because most people know me as a visual poet, mostly in the poetry world, but a lot of my poetry is really integrated with a visual art practice. And I work professionally as a designer, and it's probably been almost 20 years I've been working as a designer. And so I'm not only interested in like the lyrical composition of poems, but also in creating really unique experiences of poetry through its materials, the installation, the design, and the media production. Because my process is grounded in design thinking, I love that visual poetry for me is a space of a lot of experimentation and a lot of play. And so shortly after grad school, I found myself making a lot of artwork that was, text-based and that integrated a lot of imagery, photo archive with my writing that often became broadsides or literary art objects. And I would make this work in series towards, small exhibitions in galleries. But the more I was continuing to write, and develop this work, I started joining, writers groups and poetry organizations. And a lot of poets would really look at the work and say, I don't know why you don't turn this into some kind of book or collection, right? So it kind of started in kind of a gallery environment, but then the work really broke through when it became my first collection, which is Silent Anatomies, which was published by Corey Press in 2015. And I think in a way that's why people when they first hear my name, they think more like from a kind of a literary perspective. But that was just really more like where I just kind of encountered more people at that point. But I continue to make my work really, again, in a very studio-based approach. And in the following series, I started doing like sculptural types of poems, installations that filled, entire walls or windows of galleries. And I got really interested in astronomy. So I was using things like star maps and charts, old books about constellations as materials for creating new poems. And you'll see a lot of this research and work culminate in the new title that's coming out called Planetaria, which will be out on May 31st this spring. So I'm very excited about that.
Nice. I got a question. So because you incorporate poetry, have you always been a poet? Were you writing poems as a child or?
Yes, I definitely was always writing, always really engaged in literature. And I think when you're a student, though, you're kind of given this impression, though, that you have to like, quote unquote, pick a major, like you have to pick something. And that often really tortured me because I really felt like the way I show up to do the work that's most exciting for me is really something that exists across genres. I find myself often more attached to an idea and then learning whatever it takes to make the idea happen rather than saying, oh, I'm a painter, I guess I'll just make paintings, or, oh, I only write, this form of poetry, so I'm just going to do just that, right? And also because, I was coming of age in art school at a time when suddenly digital media made it a lot more possible for people to, bring all kinds of elements together. I saw painters, like experimenting with film in their work. I saw writers wanting to incorporate audio, right? So I think there was much more blurring of boundaries in terms of, like how we practiced in the studio. And I think I felt like rather than choosing, it felt more important to me to really just show up as myself, and that if I had a question, then I would really, employ whatever tools and strategies I could to make the kind of work that really follows that question into like a more interesting place.
And that's difficult in art school because sometimes it's not always received well when you're kind of pushing boundaries or taking it to a different place that isn't considered traditional, right? Was it a struggle or was there pushback, or were you encouraged when you were starting down this path and trying to be true to who you are? That in itself is a feat in itself, I think, in an art school.
I will say both, right? Because when I went to art school, there was a new department that had been founded, which was a digital media department. So the idea of it was great because it was about using technology to more freely explore and, kind of like follow your curiosity. And what was interesting was that our digital media seminar happened to be taught by a poet, right?
Oh, wow.
And so that was a really lucky encounter because I think she kind of noticed that I was maybe like a closeted writer who was really struggling to, put the ideas out there, but felt like, oh, this has to be like quote unquote visual, right? And I think it was a struggle for me because I was really interested in exploring my family's histories, which, had many silences and secrets that I couldn't stop writing about and that you can't make obvious in a visual way. Right. It's because, if something is secret, you can't see it. Right. So the only way you can really explore that is really, through how it interacts with the words. Right. And I think she saw that and she was like, hey, there is a whole bunch of literature kind of experimental writers who've always had a foot in, the conceptual art world and literature. Like you might want to look at them. And that's when she started passing along these books to me, like by Teresa Hakkyang Cha, who was, an Asian American avant-garde in New York City, again, working across media, and who wrote this incredible book called Dictée that like kind of threw the doors open for me, as well as, many, many other like poets who trained as painters or who, did very experimental like artist books. And so that was really kind of, fortunate. However, I also did notice though, like, when I would try to submit work to like poetry journals at the time, and this was like a long, long time ago, you would have rules like no pictures allowed in your poems. You have to use Times New Roman, and it has to be 12-point text and, double spaced. And so it was very, because in terms of like publishing, there was also like a specific template, right, that people had to like work to. So there was always a kind of tension. And I think for any creative, like starting out or trying to do something new, like you're always going to be told no, like almost all the time, But what's interesting was that the more I met other creatives who were also, making their own way, there was this ethos that was always like, if there is no door, you make a door, right? Like if there is no pathway, then you're just going to have to like get your hands dirty and like figure it out, right? And I think what I did take away from being in like a very new and kind of like formative department that was also kind of still figuring out like what is digital media and like where's that going to go. They really said, look, we're not following a template of like a long tradition, right? This is very much like we all have to really figure it out. So have like a really DIY spirit about things. Of course, it's frustrating, right? Because you're like being told no all the time. But I think underneath that, you start to learn how to develop your own compass, and you start also learning how to work against that resistance that might try to tempt you to like give up, and I have gone to poetry retreats. Like I remember going to the Kundiman poetry retreat, which is like a retreat for Asian American writers. And I brought like a medicine bottle with a poem on it that I made. These were like my medicine bottle poems. And I walked up to the instructor and I said, if this looks like a really dumb idea, just tell me now and I'll just be a web designer. Like if this is just completely like dumb, like, like, because I didn't know what I was doing. But then, this kind faculty member who actually is this incredible poet named Rick Barrett, he looked at it and he was like, I think you really should keep doing this. I really want to encourage you, just really keep following, this notion. And like, he really really embraced, my not knowing, but also embraced like the fact that I was like following a curiosity, and like doing something, felt really new to me. And the thing is that when the manuscript did win like this prize and was getting published, he like very, very happily, like wrote one of the blurbs for the book, and again, it was one of those things where you don't do this completely alone. Like, it's always great when you can find community that really encourages you to just take that risk, and to, and I was in that fragile place too, where like I was so close to just being like, maybe this is just not a good idea. I should just try to do like something quote unquote normal, but again, I was lucky enough to encounter a lot of like really great people along the way who just kept saying, there's something here and we don't know what it will be, but just keep trying, just keep going and see what happens.
That's pretty amazing, right? That when you have these people that believe enough in what you're doing and are encouraging enough to just kind of keep you going, right? When you have those questions, which I think everybody does, of whether or not they're on the right path or not, but to have somebody that you respect or just steps up and says, hey, I don't know what this is, but I see something in it and I think it's good and you should continue to go on. That's priceless right there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what's so interesting too is because I love, like talking to young people too, like now. And at first I would feel nervous, but I realized, like mentoring doesn't mean having all the answers. It just means encouraging people to really stick to the questions that are really driving them forward and just really holding space for it, like, and really just saying like, your questions could lead you somewhere really, really magical, but you got to stick with it if you want to find out,
Yeah, that can totally make or break an experience or, set somebody on a path that they're not sure whether or not it'll work out. But, if you got enough people telling you, hey, you should continue to do this, you just got to keep at it.
Yeah. And it seems like a lot of art schools really push, always putting you down. I don't even think you should be doing this. Like, I don't know why you're in this department. And it's just amazing because that would crush me because some people will rise up against it. Like, don't tell me I can't do this, but other people, when you have that kind of deep criticism from somebody, you look up to because they're a faculty and they've been doing this work, right? It could be crushing. I always like to hear because I think I would be the one that would just stop and then do something completely different. So I like the stories where people have a mentor that like, yeah, I think there's something here and you should continue it and explore it. I love that.
Yeah. And I think too, what was so great, especially being in a really kind of like a department in a really embryonic stage, was that I think people had a spirit of curiosity. And like every time there was an affinity, like, oh, Monica, like there's these artists that make text-based work, right? So they're not like quote unquote like primarily known as like literary figures, but they're definitely like huge figures of the art world, but who use text as their medium. And so they would also bring, me to artists making work like that. And, and I got like really interested in like the work of like Zhu Bing, who is, an artist from China who made a lot of work, using kind of principles of Chinese calligraphy and like, these, again, incredible installations, as well as like the work of like, Kara Walker or like Jenny Holzer. I mean, there were like, so like, just like, they're like, there's so many out there. Like, and then, always, encouraging me to go to museums. And again, where I would see texts that were not in books, right? But that were like occupying like entire walls, or that were like interesting projections on the sides of buildings. I mean, like I think at the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art in the last few years was showing these roomful installations by Laurie Anderson that you would enter, in like these VR headsets and stuff, right? So and again, really kind of allowing yourself to think outside of the typical bounds, right, of where you typically encounter texts, right? And I think just really coming from that sort of visual training, I think it helped me to really then, like, whenever I write poetry, think about how would this poem exist both on the page and off the page, and I found myself kind of like simultaneously thinking about writing like in both modes, like almost all the time, and I think in a way what helped me was to really always tell myself there's so much fun in that, and let the fun be the thing that keeps bringing you back into the studio, right? Because it's not about getting it right, like, right, because when you say I have to get it right, like that means you're answering to somebody, right? Whereas when I'm really coming from a place of questions and like, maybe this could be fun, I think it allows you then to move in the direction of creating something that can offer something that others can deeply connect with. And it's about connection, which is a different thing.
For sure. I love that perspective, what you just laid out, that it has to be fun. It should be fun, right? It's work, but it should be fun work.
Yeah. You don't want to stay up late for anything else, right?
Earlier, Wes asked you a question about if you were a writer in your youth. Were you a maker of things? Were you creating art in your youth as well?
Yeah,
Visual?
I mean, I spent a lot of time painting, like doing drawing classes. I learned like calligraphy, and I was like really all in as like the art kid, in school, like the quirky, quiet, strange art kid doing my AP art classes, and basically from high school into college, really like was just always in the art department, but also always like reading and like I always had a poetry book with me anyway, and even though I didn't like do it as like a major, I always felt like, it really helped me in terms of the foundation of how I think about the composition of ideas is very rooted in language. It's very rooted in like the lyric and narrative. So to me, I felt, it was part of my visual thinking. And I think as I moved closer to profession, I gravitated towards design because I felt like, I could be close to both, right? The words, right? The literary, whether it's like it was working typesetting books or designing, kind of like web experiences, but also still having the rigor of thinking visually all the time. So I felt like, at least working in the design space, I was always like able to like not only be close to those things in terms of just like professional work, but that it kept me consistently building my skill sets, because I think to make visual poetry for me meant really developing fluency in thinking and making, with visual tool sets as well as like, lyrical and language-based tool set. You're like cross-training all the time,
Yeah, it's a great way of looking at it. And, design, that's an art,
Mm-hmm.
There's so much that goes into it. And I probably don't need to say this, but there's a lot of terrible design out there, in addition to great design, right? But I'll just say it. I see it all the time. I'm like, oh my God, who put that together?
I remember taking it was a class called like gourmet typography, and so this was like a master typographer, and at the beginning of the class she said, okay, I'm going to apologize now because after you leave this class you will not be able to walk down the street without wanting to stab yourself in the eye. When you look at all the signage and the street signs and how terribly they're and she was kind of right. Because after the class, I was like, oh my goodness,
Yeah.
ouch, 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 because the way you see things completely shifts once you really understand, what you're looking at. And again, all that thinking and thought and effort that goes behind, the kind of work that, typographers do, right? So, yes.
Yeah, it's funny. The advent of Canva, I mean, what a great piece of, that anybody can do it, but also it's horrible because anybody can do it and nobody's schooled in it, right? See, and I work in ad specialties. I deal with people creating their own stuff all the time. And it's just like, oh my God, please stop. Like hire
Yeah.
somebody. I know a
Yeah.
couple, you know?
Yeah. Mm-hmm,
So yeah,
mm-hmm,
friends don't let friends use Canva.
Yeah. You heard it right here, folks, on the Tenet podcast, what Wes said. And,
mm-hmm.
I have a huge appreciation for typography, and typography counts for sure. That in itself is an art, and I'm blown away with what people can do, in design, typography, and all that. Those early years, was the art thing encouraged from your teachers in high school, from your family? Did you get much encouragement, or was it like, hey, you need to be pragmatic about where you're going here?
Going to mid
So
school.
So yes, I am the daughter of extremely hardworking Chinese immigrants who are born in the Philippines. So, my grandparents are from China, but they fled a war to the Philippines. And then my parents, grew up, in really big families in post-war difficult times. And my father somehow worked his bones off to finally, get into medical school. And then, he got to Chicago, and my mom hung out in Canada until he got the green card. So like they like had this whole journey, to finally get to Chicago, which is where we were born. And, and my parents were like, we were growing up, they were like looking at us like, you gonna be a doctor or are you gonna marry one? It was like, and we'd like go see family, friends, and cousins, and we'd all look at each other. It's like, okay, which one of you is gonna be the doctor for your generation? We'd
Right.
all look and we'd all be like, not it, not it, not it. Like, I mean, like no pressure or anything, like we only like fled war and like dire circumstances for you to like be here. And you're like, I actually kind of want to do art, you know? Um, and so it was a little bit, yeah, I think there were a lot of questions around our choices because obviously for them, stability looks different, right?
Sure. Yeah.
When my sister and I were coming up, again, my parents were really worried about us being told no all the time, right? They're like, well, like as women and this and that. And, it's like you want, they're like, you have to think about like how you're going to like be able to get more opportunities, And so again, I think while we had tension, and I think when we were, young and rebellious, like I thought of it as like, come on, you guys, now as a parent myself, like I completely get it, like they're like doing the best they can with what they had, what they knew, and they wanted things to be smooth sailing, for us. And my parents are like, but why would you choose to starve? Like, we don't get that, because people would say like starving artists, and
Right.
they're like, how is that even a choice? and I'd be like, no, that's not what we're trying to do. Like, that's not what it is. And I think, in college, my mom would just be like, can't you just like put a skirt on and like meet a doctor at a party or something? Like, why are you working so hard, like over there in this like little studio? You're not going to meet anybody, So like we had our back and forth, and I was probably much more emotional about it as a young adult, But I think I also, again, encountered a lot of really great communities that helped me to sort of really figure out, like, what is it that I want to contribute creatively? And also, how do you develop like a self kind of like a self-identity that's apart from your parents, that you can still negotiate with them. It's not like all or nothing, but it's more of like, I really appreciate you know, your sense of protection, but also like I tell them like, you guys took a big risk coming here, right? And I really appreciate that risk. But it's also at the same time, it's also then important to let the next generation take the risks they need to take, right? Because that may inspire somebody else down the line, right? But again, I was not that graceful about it at the time. We certainly had our disagreements, and I think certainly there was a lot of worry for sure. But I think it's one of those things where I had to always remind them there's not going to be like this one huge breakthrough moment of success and then suddenly everything's okay. It is really like slow moves over a long period of time. And I think also to like, especially if there are people struggling with that, like I remember like when I, was still a student in New York and I had started, practicing Buddhism and hung out with a lot of Buddhists who I'd always like bring my frustrations to. And someone told me something really interesting because I say, my parents criticize me all the time, and I was like really suffering about it. And he said, it's like, if people say things and you're suffering about it, it's because they're a manifestation of your own self-doubt. And that if somebody says something, the only time it really hurts you is if deep down inside you believe it too. And I was like, oh man.
That's pretty deep.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, and then they really encouraged me. So, now, and actually there was a beautiful metaphor someone told me. He was saying there was a Buddhist teacher named Jose Toda, and he said, it's like, imagine you're a glass of water and your doubt is like all the little sand at the bottom of the glass. And every time someone critiques you or you get rejected or something fails, it's like a stick stirring the water, right? And it gets cloudy and you're all like stormy and mad and upset, right? But they said, but if you really stick to the practice of rooting out your doubts, grain of sand by grain of sand, if you keep working at yourself and you clarify your direction and you take your focus not away from the outside and focus on the inside, and you take each grain of sand out, eventually that glass is going to be clear. And every time someone stirs that glass, it's going to stay clear, right? And that picture I just have always kept in my head. Every time I start feeling like the external world is discouraging me, I say, that's fine. That's those sticks are going to try to stir the waters. But the most important thing is I need to keep my glass clear of those doubts, Yeah. So I think really luckily for me, because, New York's a big city, and I met so many creatives who really encouraged me to really stay focused, and having for me just personally, having a Buddhist practice to not get swayed by my environment was really kind of fundamental to like not giving up and not, whether it was pressure from parents or again how rough the professional industry can be. I think any kind of mindfulness practice, whatever form it takes for people, I think can be helpful to just clarifying like what are my priorities and how do I make sure I stay focused so I don't give up.
Yeah. How does that practice or your practice play into what you do as an artist?
Well, typically in the morning, I usually will set aside time, whether it's like 20 minutes or an hour, just making sure I get my priorities straight. So I'll chant during that duration, and then I'll usually make a list of just actions that I envision, right? So because it's like everything's cause and effect, right? So if you really want the garden of your creative life, to flourish, just thinking about it won't actually make that happen, right? We all know that. We have to tend, we have to plant seeds, we have to water, we have to like take action, right? We have to weed out things that aren't serving us, right? And I think sometimes because it's easy to get distracted, like there's so much distraction, attention economy distraction to, our own self, imposed barriers distracting us. So I find that when I sit down and really like clarify, like, what are the distractions? What are the priorities? And then of this huge list of things to do, what are the key things that I should take action on today, or that are a little more easy to take action on? Because, again, it's like there's a lot of shoulda, woulda, coulda, but I'm also practical. I'm like, you know what, though, I'll get these 3 things done quicker today, than if I try to take on a huge thing that's going to be too, much too cumbersome. So I like break down things into smaller tasks. And then I like just prioritize it around like the busy, because I work full time too. I'm a parent. I have friends that I try to see once in a while, right? Like, there's, we're all doing like schedule, like Tetris with our schedules. So I think just taking the time to really be strategic, but also like honest about like, how do I feel? Am I tired? Do I need some rest today? Are there other things that I should make sure I'm really tending to? Like I haven't called my sister, So like just really seeing the whole, like being holistic. I think that's because it's different than trying to be an overachiever and like doing 100 things on a list. For me, those days are over because it's easy to burn out. But I think coming from a more holistic perspective of like, you're tending a garden, so you can't like you can't yell at the flower to bloom now. I need the success now. Like that's just not how it works, especially as an artist. Like we know all the good stuff takes time. You can't demand that of your work like that, So it's more about like, what causes can I make? What seeds can I plant? How can I just keep nourishing these projects and then allow them to blossom at the time that they're meant to blossom? Not trying to control it, but rather really be the kind of gardener that can like tend and really trust the process. I think that's a very different thing. And I think, again, like when I chant for like the wisdom and also patience, it makes it a lot easier, because I think otherwise I will tend to have that, impatient overthinking mind at the driver's seat. And so I'm trying to keep that person in the back seat so that I can have the more patient. And I think the person that shows up to drive hopefully is the one that has more faith, right, in the process.
That's nice. I like that.
Has it taken you a while to get to this point?
I mean, I've been practicing almost 25 years now. And I think because it's kind of something that I've integrate it into my life at the same time that I was also like growing as an artist, I think those harmonize really well together, And the thing is that also it helps me understand more and more that I still have lots more to learn. And especially when you become a parent, you're like, your kid is always reminding you of that. I think, like, I have to say, like, I think my son was teaching me how to crochet something during spring break. And I kept messing up, taking it apart and starting over again. And I'm like, oh, this is so hard. And he goes, Mom, that's okay. All you need to do is learn how to count. I was like, thanks.
Right. Out of the mouth of babes, right? Like,
yeah,
the script gets flipped and you're always learning something.
Yeah. It's like, it keeps you humble.
Yeah, for sure. It keeps it real, right?
Yeah.
And, and going back to your parents, I mean, time and perspective are important things, right? Like when you were your son's age, you didn't see it the same way that you do now. Now that you're a parent, and then looking back on their journey and their struggles and what they provided you, you have much more of an appreciation, even if at that moment it didn't feel like it as you were growing up. But as an adult, you go, you know what? They were, like you said earlier, they were just doing the best they could with what they had and trying to provide you, as a parent, your children are everything. and you would do anything in the world for them, and you don't want to see them suffer, and you don't want to see them struggle. You want to see them be successful, and that's a legitimate feeling, I think. At the same time, you have to give them enough space to let them spread their wings. And we all know that success doesn't come necessarily from success. It comes from failing. It comes from having little bumps in the road that, kind of set you on a certain path and contribute to that success.
I totally agree. And it's so interesting how much my relationships with my parents really changed too over the course of the different projects that I've done, particularly with Silent Anatomies. I was really interested in family history, but I don't speak fluently all the different languages, that people speak in my family. I have cousins that speak, Tagalog, which is, spoken in the Philippines. But then my grandmother, and her siblings and a lot of my elders speak Hokkien, which is from the southern province of China. A lot of folks that left that southern area to the Philippines speak Hokkien, right? Or Fujian. Sometimes it's called Fujian. And between my parents, they speak those two as well as Mandarin, which is the national, official language of China, and then English, right, with us. And I remember that we traveled, to the Philippines and China together to kind of visit with people. And then I took photographs and then I was interviewing relatives. And what was so interesting was that before, my dynamic with my parents was they were like the authority, and then I was the dutiful daughter. So the communication was very one way. It was like, you're supposed to do this, and then I'd either agree or disagree, right? And oftentimes I was disagreeing. But then what happened, it was so interesting that when they started helping me translate, for this project, we suddenly became like collaborators. And it wasn't such a vertical relationship. It was starting to kind of become slightly more horizontal, which was really new for them and really new for me. And it was I was hearing stories about them that I didn't even know about. I met an uncle. She's like, oh, there's this uncle in China. And I was like, which uncle? She was like, oh, he's this other one, but we never told you about him. And I was like, what? She's like, well, my mom adopted a boy from a poor family, but there was also this folklore that if you adopt a boy, you can also get pregnant with more boys because my grandparents wanted to have many sons, but in my mom's family, they had 5 daughters and 2 sons, and it was there was this whole thing about gender, right? And I saw these pictures of this boy in these photographs that I was like, I have no idea who this is. And she was like, oh, you want to meet him? We can look for him in China. And I was like, okay. And we went to that little town, and my grandmother saw her brother and sister who she hadn't seen in many, many years. And then we met this I call him the mystery uncle. And we sat down and we had dinner, But again, it was suddenly all of these things I didn't know about my family. It's and my parents would be like, no, but oh yeah, that was just a detail we forgot to tell you. And I'm like, it's kind of a big deal, Mom. And she'd be like, oh, it's just, we have all kinds of things, I'd be like, wow, okay.
That engagement is important, and sometimes we take it for granted, and sometimes it's painful too, and people don't want to talk about certain things. Mm-hmm. A lot of times, and I think about my parents because they're getting up in age, mm-hmm. some things that my dad has Alzheimer's, so there's some things he just doesn't track or remember, but those stories are important. It really, whether you realize it or not, it helps inform not only your relationships and your family, but also, sometimes it can help you figure out some of the things that you have going on and the way, why they are the way they are, right?
Oh, it's such a gift, really. I think the more I learn about them, I think my appreciation, my sort of, just awe really of like, again, their journey really deepened over the years. And I think also it really is something that I enjoy sharing, with my son, because he's becoming really interested in like, like tell me more about this, or like what was that history about? And in a way, when I create my work, in some ways, yes, it's like, fun, it's creative curiosity, but there was a part of me too that is like trying to kind of archive and preserve whatever memories, and insights, details, textures, tastes, anything I can, because I think that's kind of like a diaspora instinct, right? Like that having two generations that like, left, the places that they were born, I could always see like my mom, she would always, trying to recreate old recipes, right? Or she'd be, like looking at old photos, because that's just like the pieces that she still has, and I see myself doing that in my artwork too. It's like, just tell me a little more about that detail, or, what was her name again? And again, like, like we had a reunion with my family like over spring break this spring. And again, like in casual conversation, my sister's like, wait, did she just drop this new fact on us that we didn't know about? Like, and so it's like, there's always these little things, but my parents, they're very like, they're not going to be like, let us tell you chronologically in order, like everything that that's just not how they are, and it's kind of like, I remember my husband was trying to document like a recipe from my mom. And I remember he had like a notebook, he had a pen, and he'd be like, okay, tell me exactly how many cups you used in that recipe. And she looked at, and he's like, how did you measure it? And she's like, she looks at him, she goes, measure? Like, what do you mean? He was like, well, how many cups? And then she's like, I don't know. And she's just like flinging her finger, you throw here, and then you do a little there, and then, and then this, and then you just do to taste. And then, and like, my husband, he's from like a lineage of like, like very German precision. And he was just like dumbfounded. He's like, what? Because she's like, oh, you just follow your taste, and she's very instinctual, and it's just whatever comes up in her mind, like she'll remember, oh, like my aunties or my mother used to like also throw in a little this here and there. And so it's like very instinctual, but it's like nothing's written down, nothing is, in like a perfect book or anything. It's just something that like in the moment she conjures,
Right.
and that is so different than maybe what we're used to in terms of how like meticulously things can be archived, here, right?
Right. Yeah. And I think it's so important to talk to your elders because, I even think of the stories my grandfather would tell and then my dad, but my kids don't hear these stories. I tell some of them, but there's so many stories I've already forgotten, or I'll have to ask my dad for clarification. And kind of like Todd's dad, my dad has a really bad short-term memory, and it's starting to affect his long-term memory. Those stories will slowly die. And just think of all the stories, of previous generations that have gone away because they weren't, told down. So it's so important to keep those stories alive as much as you can. And recipes, even if you have to learn it the hard way, a dash here and a dash there.
At least my husband gets to taste test everything. He loves that part.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
good.
that sounds like a good job. I would sign up for that.
Yeah, totally.
When you graduated from RISD, you started your professional career as a designer. At the same time, you're working on your own work, I take it? Is that the way?
Yep.
Okay. Talk a little bit about that journey and some of the challenges that you face, because you're balancing, and we've talked to tons of artists that, have a job in the creative field or totally unrelated to the creative field that they do, but they're full-time artists. They're still, full on their practice.
So yes, definitely not for the faint of heart. I started, working as a designer in, an academic university, which, can be rigorous because, there's lots of deadlines. There's tons of stakeholders that you're working for. And it's a full-time 40-hour kind of week. And I realized that, if I really wanted to also continue stewarding my own ideas and my own work, then, I really would have to learn how to carve out, like time consistently. And thankfully, I met my husband in art school, and we both made it very clear that like part of the job we do for each other is to protect each other's studio time. I think that really is helpful. I think having being very clear about like who your network of support is, it has a lot to do with how I was able to stay consistent over the years. Every residency I've been to where I've left home for a period of time, or every like conference or every trip, like he happily would like hold it down or make arrangements with his family to support, so I'm so grateful and actually feel very lucky to just have a partnership that feels like like we're on a team, and likewise, for his work, as he's a designer as well, but very different kind. He does more like product and industrial design, which is also very demanding. But I think it's like different enough where, we can kind of have, a little different spaces that we occupy as designers, but overlapping enough where he is definitely also the person that tries to keep me really honest, so because sometimes, I love having lots of ideas. Very easily I'll be like, oh, I'm working on this, but this idea is also super cool. I'm like so excited about it. Da, da, da. And he'll just sit back and he'll kind of look at me and be like, is that a distraction project? Like, is that the project you really need to work on? Or is that the one you're making up to avoid the project you should be working? And I'm like, oh, darn it. He got me again. Like, you know what I mean? Like, but it's like, it's like having friends, whether it's a friend or a studio mate or an accountability part, like just people who know you so well to like make sure that you cut your BS and like actually get to it is like really huge, And again, I just feel really appreciative of that because it's so easy, to get distracted. And I think, we try to make it clear, like, yes, we have our family priorities, we have our whatever, like adulting priorities, but we also make it very clear, like, what are the creative priorities, and to kind of like call each other out when needed, because again, it's like you don't do this alone. I mean, I'm very clear about that with myself. Like, I know what my strengths and my tendencies are, but I also know like I know what my weaknesses are too, but I know when I like willfully like ignore them, or like pretend, oh, nothing's going on. And like he can kind of call me out on that. So I think when I was working weekends, we'd be, we shared studio space, and, we moved a few times, and eventually we moved to a house that had space that, he eventually converted the garage to his studio space, and then I converted the basement into my studio space. So we also have separate studio spaces, but really, again, try to work our schedules around some consistency to be able to make work. And I think when my son was born, it was like, okay, this is a lot. And it was super, I think it was super challenging because, he was so young. But I think, again, like, you kind of corral, like you figure out like who's your support team, how do you, and luckily like my in-laws moved close by. So again, everyone in some way like tried to pitch in so that I could somehow, even if it was like in the daycare parking lot, I would be writing. Or sometimes my son would be at like, kung fu practice, and for like half an hour, 45 minutes. And so I'd say, okay, fine, that's a half hour. Do the best you can in the car with it, and bring a little light, and doing something is better than nothing. And I think sometimes what is important is for creatives to let go of like these sort of romantic ideas of what a creative practice is supposed to look like, and instead really look at like where you really are, And then really say, like, even though I'm not wearing a beret and I'm not sitting in a French cafe and I don't have like 5 hours of unlimited time, that's okay. Like, it's okay if you are like sitting in the Trader Joe's parking lot, texting ideas into your phone because you have to run to like an ortho appointment in 15 minutes. Like, that's fine. Because I think to me, it's more about learning to make small moves consistently. And again, just building upon it and not worrying about what it looks like, in comparison to other people, but just really say, like, where are the spaces in the life I have at this moment where I can just create or think of one thing, write one line, make one sketch, ideate. Silent Anatomies came out in 2015. So my son was like 3. And they were like, oh, you have to travel and you're going to have to do these readings. And I was like terrified. I was like, what? Now I have to like get up in front of people and what? It was like very overwhelming. But again, it's just like you go back to like, okay, what are my basics? Like I can definitely just focus on today. Just think about like what are 2 or 3 causes or moves I can make today, and just like put one foot in front of the other, and over time, like, you just take every mistake, because I made a lot of mistakes, like I was doing, I don't know, like events without properly preparing because I was like up all night with my son who was like crying from night terrors, to, like trying to figure out how to do an artist talk, 4 hours of sleep. And you have to have a lot of like self-compassion to let yourself kind of like work through all the newness and make lots of mistakes, and just, again, be able to have the wisdom say, there are no mistakes there. They're just learning experiences. So if I can come away from each thing that maybe didn't land right, or I didn't feel like I really, fully expressed what I wanted to say, then to just go back and say, okay, what can I learn from this? And then build that list and then come back to that. And then over time, it's like, it gets a little easier. And, and then my son's much more independent now. He's a teenager now. And it's like easier for me to go away for longer stretches of time to do residencies. I started doing residencies in the summertime, like every summer, since my son was like kind of in his toddler years. So like over time, he's gotten used to, me like traveling for things. But I think he's learned, what he says to me is, it's so cool to see you doing the things that you dreamed of doing, and he's like, it makes me want to like have a big dream too,
Nice.
And so it's like, what I mean? Rather than feeling like, oh, why aren't you around? Like when they start seeing that garden start to flower, they're kind of like, ooh, like I want that too. Again, it was one of those things where I really had to trust that process, because I did worry. Like I did have mom guilt, and I did have like a lot of like, oh, oh, I feel really torn, or should I be here? Should I be there? I think for sure, like we're always going to wrestle with those doubts. But I think that when we really also put into practice taking steps towards certain dreams that, also give nourishment to other people, and that, can hopefully make a contribution, in the best case scenario, it really encourages the people watching you to like kind of dare to do that too. So, and what's really cool is, because I started this whole, like I got so interested in astronomy for this series. My son is like totally excited about space and like, like astronomy, and like, he's like in, I don't know, like 4 books into this like hard science fiction series. So because, I took him to planetariums all the time as part of my research, but then it was like, you figure out how do I integrate being a parent with also like quote unquote research. It was just sort of like, again, turning everything into a field trip. Like, oh, let's go to the Air and Space Museum. Let's go to the NASA Space Center together. And, because for him, it was like, oh my God, this is so cool. And then for me, I was like, oh, okay, maybe I could write a couple more poems about this, That's what I think is great about being a creative, is that, whether it's the medium you want to get great at or a particular goal, like we can also be creative about the life you build around the studio practice so that everyone can be a part of it, rather than it being apart from your life. I really realized, like, just because, because I really want to enjoy that motherhood experience, I was really, really adamant about it, like all of these things collaborating together. Over the years, I mean, we've had a lot of fun, I have to say, because, they love being able to travel with me to do readings in different cities or, again, going to openings together and things like that. So, I think it's the more we can think about these things holistically together, it actually, at least for me, takes away that layer of stress of like, oh, I have to choose, right? Because I think there are a lot of like kind of mythologies about what an artist is that maybe make people feel like they have to give up something to do it. But to me, I feel like those kind of feel outdated now.
Yeah.
I think there's certainly a way, if we kind of dream a little bit more broadly and creatively, because again, it's not a romantic idea of what an artist's life looks like, but it's just more of like focusing on like really understanding the shape of each individual's own life and how that shape, like how do you work with the shape of what you have? Because it's so different for each person,
I love that attitude and your philosophy and how you go about it and how you look at it in a wider perspective as more of a collaboration. So good for you. And I'm glad you spoke to that because I think there's a lot of people out there that needed to hear exactly what you just laid out. Wes, go ahead.
Let's move on to silent anatomies. And let's talk about silent anatomies. How did that come about? Where did that idea come from? And then what was it like putting it together? And if you could kind of talk about like your ideal method of writing and creating, and what comes first, what comes later, or is it all just kind of intertwined?
Thank you. No, I love these questions. Well, as you know, I'm the daughter of a physician, and I grew up around a lot of medical ephemera, whether it was medical textbooks, anatomical diagrams, to like, medical items, medicine bottles, like really interesting tools, things like that, as well as like acupuncture charts or things from Chinese medicine shops, because I also, again, my relatives had many, many different ideas and attitudes and beliefs around health. And oftentimes when I would get together, with family, like my father was like a student of like clinical Western style medicine, very kind of like, all the charts and numbers and research studies. But I also had a family that also believed in like spirits or espíritus, they'd call it, and like Chinese medicine to other kinds of superstitious beliefs, about the body. And sometimes these would kind of, again, like rub up against each other. And I noticed a lot of like silences too, around the body, that there were things that people didn't want to speak about. I had one of my mother's elder sisters. She was very ill all the time. And my grandmother would tell people it was because spirits lived in her body. But my father, who, worked at a mental health institution in Illinois, he was like, well, no, like she has mental health issues, but they don't want to speak it out loud. And again, instead of really, saying what it is out loud, there were all these like kinds of fictions that would be created around, different family members or just different people that we knew in our lives. And so these cultural silences kind of became something I kept thinking about and then started to write about. And what I would kind of start doing was, kind of taking things like, like medicine bottles and then taking family photographs. And then rather than kind of writing, the sort of typical medical instructions or prescriptions, I would kind of take the style of that language and instead insert kind of an eye looking into some of these silences or these stories. Or sometimes I would find, like anatomical diagrams and take the medical language out and then replace it with my own writing, as well. And again, thinking about, are there memories or kind of visceral, aspects or sensations or experiences that I can locate, to that diagram maybe. They almost became kind of like prompts to kind of go a little deeper. And one of my favorite poems, though, it's called The Attic. It's this diagram of the inner ear. And what's interesting is that in the inner ear, there is a part of the inner ear called the attic. And what I did when I found that diagram was I designed into it an old photograph of the home that my father's parents lived in the Philippines, because I also think of the attic as like, that's where like you kind of store these memories, and they're there, they're always there, and you might not see them for a while, but sometimes you go up to the attic and you dust it off and you're like, what's this whole world of stories here, And then what I would do is I would take, some of these terms and then turn them into sort of like section markers, for each set of verse, for the poem. Do you want me to maybe try reading this poem?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, we'd love that.
Okay. So the attic, so again, it's made with a diagram of the eternal and middle ear. Okay, the attic. By the time you are born, what I know of this world will be well on its way to extinction. Above your crib, the floorboards creak as I make more room in this attic. Number 1, Oracle. Remember to play games made with ivory or shells. I like backgammon and mancala the best, the way my fingers brush against my mother's hands to pick up all the pieces. Enjoy the collective clink of sticks on Corningware, spinning on a lazy Susan. We don't lock doors in this house, and in the summers, the windows glow with fireflies. When I say in the first tone, Lai Tia, it is me asking you to bring your warm body to the family room, heart within heart. 2, Membrana Tympani. Do not walk the streets plugging your ears with digital waves. What of the ocean's breath or the patter of tongues that play over mangoes and plastic bags? Perhaps you will be able to feel my father's vibrato in your chest and notice the long hair on his Adam's apple as he sings over hissing scallions. At the table, I will sit with you quietly, not looking away even once until you are done. In Hokkien, tia also means to listen. 3, Malleus. You will never hear the crackle of landlines, how they shroud Amma's voice like a fishing boat in the mouth of a monsoon, as she mourns Grandpa's fate in the shark-infested waters. There are no schools to teach you the diction of our kin who fled. These eyes can't even make out the markings. When we say it in the 4th tone, tia is the word for ache. 4, internal carotid. Go to the countries that have not yet been named. No need to hum like me on my sewing machine, for I have already embroidered my story in blood. There will be a larger hum, beckoning you beyond the laurel trees, through door upon open door, towards cranes that climb endlessly up the sky. At night, I will thumb my red spool of thread and tug at you, mend your tears, whisper while you are sleeping, Gua Zin Tia Di, my child, for Tia is the other name for love.
Wow.
That's amazing.
That is. It's beautiful.
Yeah, because I was playing, there's in Hokkien, there's a word tia, right? That means listen, right? So it's, and you can hear the verses often are describing sounds, different sounds from the family. But, there's a lot of homonyms because there's different tones, in Chinese. So when you say tia, it's listen. But when something hurts, it's like tia, yeah, tia. It really hurts. But then when you love somebody, you'll say, wa ya tia, tia di. So it's like pain, heartache, listening. It's all said with the same tia, but with different tones. But again, almost like not accidentally, right?
Right.
Yeah. Context, right? Context matters.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I love the idea of like even like love hurts, like the pain of love, you know. Yeah, that's amazing. That was amazing. I love that one. That's
Yeah.
beautiful.
Thank you for sharing with us.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
that
Yeah.
was perfect. Um, when you create work, do you think at all about audience, or is it solely just whatever you're feeling and that intuitiveness that goes into it?
I think of it in different phases of the making. So, for example, when I'm just in the writing phase, I'm just writing. I'm like really just exploring, and I think of it as like, you're just kind of going to you're into your interior landscape and just kind of like you're hiking and you're just kind of like noticing things, gathering things, and really just trying to really pay attention. And so I'm not necessarily thinking about audience at that point. I'm just really exploring, right? Like just really going as deep as I can. However, whenever I'm thinking about like, okay, so what does this poem want to become? Like, how do I want to produce it? I do think about audience more from the standpoint of the way a designer thinks. So, you're always thinking about like user experience, right? And I remember, when I was thinking about these insomnia poems that I wrote for Planetaria, I was thinking a lot about like, how would I want someone to experience these poems? And I kept thinking a lot about all the sleep tapes and the sleep channels I listened to fall asleep because I struggled and still struggle very much with insomnia, and I actually listen to texts that activate something in me to help me, try to get to the land of sleep, right? And so these texts operate in a very different way. They're designed differently. There's a sonic landscape, right, that it works together with. So even though you do see the poems like printed on the page, when I first put them out there, they were like audio installations, in the gallery, right? And so I turned them into recordings. I worked with another reader and like a musician who helped me, to create some ambient, sounds, because it was important for the text to exist in that type of context because it is so connected to sleep. And again, it's like the tension between sleep and insomnia, I think is more heightened in that sense. And then when I was thinking about the visuals for the insomnia poems, I kept coming back to these diagrams that were created by, I think it was like a psychologist. He wanted to geometrically map the human psyche. And so created these really, geometrical maps. When I looked at the original charts, though, I kept thinking to myself, like in the map in the landscape, within me, I think the ghosts of my ancestors would be everywhere. They'd be like walking around all the time. And so naturally, then I started thinking about how could I take those diagrams and then collage them with, again, images from the family archive and, whether it was like images of foliage from, around my grandmother's home or just little details. I started creating these collages that then I wrote towards, as I was creating these insomnia poems. And then those visual elements eventually got printed onto custom silk pillows that I would put into these audio environments. So it was like, again, a way to create kind of a restful, welcoming space for people to sit and rest and then listen, to these poems about the things keeping me up at night. So, but again, it's like, that's how I think about my audience is sort of like, how do you create an environment where people can really slow down and spend time with the poem and have either a close listening or a close reading? And I think by doing that, it's more about really offering the poem to the audience as a gift, So it's just more in that spirit and again, I know because when people say user experience designer, it sounds very like business-like or something.
Right. Yeah.
But really it's really coming from the spirit of like, how am I creating an ideal environment for the visitor to have a deep connection with this piece that hopefully resonates, in their life in a way that feels memorable or at least unique.
So still the poetry and the imagery is still authentic to you and your story and what you're exploring, but then the user experience piece comes in the presentation, that the interaction between the audience. So that's wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so smart that you think in those terms, because, I don't think that everyone thinks in those terms, but especially because of what you're doing, melding the written word with the visual, I think it is so important to have that thought of, okay, what is going to be this experience that these folks are going to have when they get to see this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I find it fascinating, and I'm going to touch on this right now just because you mentioned it and I wanted to ask you this question, but I'm always fascinated on how other people's brains work. I find that endlessly fascinating. And I think it's interesting that you're a practicing Buddhist, and part of that, and I don't know a ton about about Buddhism. I have a basic working foundation, but I know one of the things is meditation and kind of quieting your mind on some level, yet you can't turn your mind off at night, So there's this contrast, right? This yin and yang that is going back and forth, between your practice and then, everything else that's going on in modern day society that you just, for whatever reason, can't get away from, right? So what are those things that are going through your head that are playing in your mind that are keeping you up at night?
Oh my goodness. I mean,
I know it's a loaded question, but
I mean, look, it's a lot right now. I mean, like for just, right? Like just in general, I think there's so much folks are navigating. And also, I think a lot of folks, or at least for me, it's like you're always trying to figure out, like, given the big messiness of the world, right? Trying to figure out, like, okay, like where is my next step, or like how are we creating places of belonging, right, and community, and how do we continue to move forward in a way where, despite all the all the messy things going on, right, that we can still create spaces of mutual, respect and belonging, right? And I think, again, like, I think there's that, but then there's also, like, how am I going to do all of this, too? Like these questions of, like, okay, I have all these deadlines, and then, there's all these other things you're planning, whether it's like, helping the family get through things. But then also on top of that, life just throws lots of unexpected things your way on top of all of that, And I think that's the thing, is it's like, no matter how smooth sailing other people's lives look like, I always know, like, swans underneath, they're paddling really hard, right? In a lot of people's interior lives, there's lots of questions that are being unpacked, a lot of knots that are still being people are trying to figure out how to untie a lot of knots. I think, to me too, it's like, my like, I always think about, like, how when I write, I'm always writing with my ancestors, right? And so I still feel in conversation with them, partly because I didn't get to know or see them very much as a child. Like, my parents came and they left a lot of their family, in Asia to be here. So there is this kind of, like, longing and almost like unfinished conversation that I feel like I still continue to have with them. I'm sure I was like, I was probably also very anxious, like a daughter of immigrants, not always really sure of who I was, right? Because, again, like, in some circles, it was like, oh, you don't quite fit in, you're not quite American enough. But then I would go to other circles where they would just be like, well, like, you can't even speak Chinese well, so what are you even doing here? Like, I think there's a lot of that, sort of like, I think you have to, like, work through a lot of stuff to finally get to a place of, like, you know what? I just am who I am. And I think it's more important to move forward with, like, curiosity and questions rather than, again, like, I've learned, like, the pursuit of trying to fit in a box of any kind is one that never ends well, at least not for me, right? And I think in the insomnia, at least when I'm experiencing it or when I'm writing about it, I think it's just like I feel like I'm just always going back to those conversations, with my ancestors about like, where is this all leading? Where is it all going? And kind of like just saying like, I hope it's really going somewhere interesting, but who knows? What's interesting is like during the pandemic, we got a puppy named Waffles, and he started coming up to bed to sleep with me. And I have to say, it's been awesome because it's like, I don't know what it is, but it's like I wake up and he's like right there, and we're just hanging out, and I fall right back asleep now, which is like that hasn't really been the case for many years. So like that's been a really cool discovery lately. But again, to your point though, I can't imagine how I would be if I didn't chant, because it would probably be way worse.
I love your outlook. I mean, it sounds like you don't look at this thing as a destination ever. It's just part of your journey, right? And I was going to ask you, if you did in your evolution as a person, as becoming a fully formed person, which that never completely happens, right? We're all working towards being better and evolving, hopefully. If you ever did kind of struggle with identity, and in some of the poems, I guess I kind of read into that a little bit, that maybe there was some things that maybe you were processing.
Definitely. I think there's often a lot of rhetoric, and I think even pressure to like declare a team of some kind, right? And I think as a human being, I don't find that to be that useful sometimes, because the thing is that I think who we are is a lot bigger, than like a label or, a team and also I think too, again, coming from, a Buddhist perspective, my sense is that, every lifetime you come in the form that allows you to do the best work for that moment in time. Who knows where you're going to go next lifetime, right? It could be completely different. And so to me, it's about being a lot less attached to, like, again, less attached to a very specific kind of, like, let's say box maybe, and more interested in, like, what is the offering or the contribution that you want to make, And I remember, because sometimes, too, like you'll go to spaces and people will ask you to declare, well, so what are you? Are you Filipina? Are you Chinese? Are you Asian American? And I would be so befuddled like all the time, because I always felt like, if I said one thing, I felt like someone was going to pipe up. We'll be like, well, not really, because like you always worry like I'm underqualified or something. and so after a while, I just really, like, the more I thought about it, the more I was like, if I were to give it any, I guess, like, name, I like the idea of like bodhisattva, because it's just a Buddhist word that means I'm just here to help. That's it.
Nice.
So so that's really, for me, it's like, I'm just here to help. So whatever form that takes, and I think in a way, like, I see how I operate in the same way when I make work, when I make a poem. It's like, whatever form that takes, I'll do whatever it takes to learn, and art school my way to figuring whatever that is out in order to help, that poem or that art become what it needs to be.
So you're in service to the poetry or to humanity, depending
That's
on
right.
yeah.
Yep.
Nice.
So from silent anatomies to Planetaria, how has the work evolved?
So I would say in silent anatomies, I was definitely looking back into history. I was doing a lot of interviewing into the past, asking questions to my elders, right? And the body too is like, it felt like, it's this kind of like you're looking in, looking at like diagrams of microscopic scans or, or perhaps x-rays of the body. So it felt, it's like kind of like this sort of microcosm, right? And what I noticed in Planetaria is how my gaze shifted in a different direction. So Planetaria felt to me future forward, right? And I was often in conversation with my son. So I wrote this after he was born, and he was kind of like, again, also wrestling with, what's the future going to be like? And, kind of thinking in a different direction. And also, that he was asking me the questions. He was like, we were looking at like star charts, and he was like, well, Mom, do you know anything about like the Chinese night sky? And I was like, actually, I don't. But you know what? That sounds like a really, really great area of research, And so he actually kind of inspired me to just, kind of start, like exploring a whole different, star system that I knew nothing about. And it felt like something that was like in conversation like with his generation, right? As opposed to, the generations before me. Although again, they still show up. I mean, they pop up in like, like every other piece. But again, more in the context of these conversations I'm having, with him, right? And I think when you move from using the framework of the body, of like the human body, to the framework of like the cosmos, it kind of moves from like microcosm to like this macrocosm, right? And so the view becomes like, again, more kind of like cosmic, but I think also really made me think about time too, like in a much like broader way, and space as well, physical space, but also this idea of the distances between people. And I really enjoyed that. It's nice to like, kind of, when you're working, let's say when you're working in a particular scale, to go into a completely different scale, or like to change materials. So it kind of felt like that I was really shifting my gaze and challenging myself to stretch, in a completely different way. Even though both really still use science as a kind of reference, or a jumping point for the writing. But I feel like, again, there were like shifts in direction and space that I found really interesting.
I love that. That's so cool. So your son was really kind of a catalyst to go down this path and explore all this.
Yeah, I think, because he also had such an interest in, like space and astronomy. We were like watching a lot of Cosmos episodes together and going to museums. It was super fun. Like, again, it definitely allowed us to have really good adventures. And I think also, in a way to I really embraced play so much more, because I think, when you come out of grad school, you're like, oh, I have to be so serious. I have to be so like smart. I have to like, like all it's like very, like, and, I think there was a place for it. When I found myself taking it too seriously, I was like not having as much fun. So I think when I was doing research and I had to make it like fun for my kid, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm having fun too. Like, this is really like, it just helped bring me back to like a different approach, and again, to like, when you do something for over many years too, especially in the studio, there's a temptation to fall into formula. Like, oh, that worked, so I'll just keep doing that. Right. But I think, when you're seeing the world through the eyes of kid, they'll be like, oh, we already did that. That's so boring. Like, let's do something completely different. Let's turn it upside down. Let's do it inside out. Let's do it backwards. Yeah. And then I realized like, that's so great for creative practice, right? To like not fall into formula, but to be willing to just say, okay, I already did that. So let's blow it up. Let's completely take this from a completely, fresh perspective, and then see what happens. And I think that's a very healthy thing, at least for me, because it allows me to then just keep trying new things. And, because I always talk to my son about like, we got to try new foods. He's like, not another vegetable, Mom. I'm like, okay. But I'm like, we got to keep trying new things. And he's like, okay. And so I think, again, it just helps me reflect on my own practice too, of like, am I just getting comfortable? Am I making a habit choice, right? Or am I willing to make a growth choice of going outside of my comfort zone and like, taking a risk?
Take a moment and talk about some of the topics that you're exploring with this new body of work and this new book, Planetaria.
Well, I really enjoyed, using the visual language of astronomy to really explore like working motherhood, the hidden histories of, women in science, but also, my the continued inquiry into my own family's like diaspora history as well. And I really, often think about also like the way a lot of like science textbooks feel like very authoritative, right? Like, and almost like, here's how things work, and like almost like these are the rules, right? But at the same time, noticing how even scientists also were always interested in experimenting or testing rules. Some of them made discoveries that overturned, how we thought of the world, right? To help us have a much better, a deeper understanding. So there's a tension, right, between getting attached to a very fixed idea of how the world works, but also this sense of adventure of being willing to, kind of test it and see and experiment our way into a deeper understanding, which, potentially undo, right, like some of the ideas that we've gotten used to, right? And I think a lot of those stories like really intrigued me, when I was researching this book, because it made me think a lot about cultural traditions that we can sometimes feel perhaps constrained by, or that maybe are a bit rigid, right? And how do you navigate, your life, the choices in your life in a way creatively, where perhaps you can hold those things but not be constrained by them, So, and I also did a lot of just sort of like formal experimentation, whether it was seeing a planisphere, for example. I saw a planisphere that was so cool. They were like, turn it to the date of your friend's birthday and you'll see the stars, like what the sky will look like. And I saw that and I couldn't stop thinking about it, because I was like, wouldn't it be so cool if you could turn it to like that special day and saw the stars, but then the stars like spoke a poem to you, That was the kind of impetus for me, finding a translation for the Chinese night constellations, and then transcribing, and then and selecting, kind of like the most lyrically interesting stars that were there, and then writing my own verses to kind of connect them in a way. Whichever direction you would read, you would be able to somehow land on some kind of poem, right? And so that was kind of like a design project I ended up giving myself. It took me almost a year to get that piece done, but it was super fun though,
The stargazer planisphere poetry, this is exactly what you're talking about, right?
That's right. Yes. Yes.
Monica actually just held it up on screen. Talk a little bit more about how this operates. And this is also available through your website, correct?
Yes. So this is available through proximavera.com. It was a micropress that I founded a few years ago to be able to make the work available to collections and folks interested in checking out, these projects. It's a piece that, operates like a planisphere in the ways in which you would align the desired date to the hour that you're looking up at the sky. And when you have those aligned, you can then notice, in the part of the chart that's visible, like that would be the view of the sky if you were facing south, looking up, right? And the words that you see kind of scattered across the chart is made up of some of the names of some of the asterisms and some of the original writing that I kind of wrote to kind of like, kind of connect them, if you will. What's interesting about the Chinese night sky is that it's slightly different than the Greco-Roman sky that we're used to. The Greco-Roman sky has like 88 really large constellations, and there's like kind of mythical gods and monsters, kind of these creatures, right? In the Chinese night sky, it's actually made up of over like I think 263 asterisms. Asterisms are like smaller clusters. They're clusters of stars that are a little bit smaller than the kind of the constellations that we typically see. There's 263 asterisms made from over 1,560 individual stars. And they kind of reflect the, social and kind of geographic landscape of the emperor and his court. In the middle of the sky, like near where the North Star is like the seat of the great emperor of heaven, because he's the center of the world. And then you might see things like horses or like orchards, and the kind of around the center area, he had like a lot of characters that were like, maidens and, generals. But then, as you go around the planisphere, there's also, things like, like wells and temples of ancestors. So kind of things you would see in like quotidian life, like night markets, butchers, right? What I did was I kind of, selected asterisms that had like a lot of like kind of like lyrical potential to me, that like kind of had really interesting sounds or names. Like there's one asterism called A Whisper in One's Ear, for example. And I thought, gosh, that would be beautiful if it kind of appeared as part of a poem, right? So I kind of like curated some of my favorite like asterism names. And then as I wrote kind of like some other more personal verses, I found that when I let my eyes kind of wander around the planisphere, that, you just get different combinations of verses that make up poems. And you can play games with this. Like I've certainly done things where you kind of pick different verses and then write them down in different orders and then have a different poem. For other people, it's about like, what does the planisphere poem sound like in spring versus in the winter? Or if I read it, at night, at a certain hour of night, or if I read it like a really early in the morning. So again, it's the kind of, poem that can have infinite possibilities depending on who's reading it and when.
Wow. That's great.
That's fantastic. I love the thought process, and it's amazing that people can come up with this, that your mind went to this place and you can incorporate all these different elements. I think it's brilliant.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Well, and I think too, like one of the conceits of the whole collection too was about rethinking the sky from like a female perspective, because you have a lot of figures of conquest in the sky, right? Like people who like are hunters, and like people who are like gods that like, and emperors, right? And what I did kind of intentionally was that, kind of in the seat, near the seat of the emperor, rather than kind of labeling it like, hey, this is the emperor's place, I was thinking a lot about that marker, like, when you go to the mall and it says like, you are here, and to me, it was about like, what if I made the reader the center of this sky instead, like what would happen, So sometimes it's fun to kind of really read it and then really kind of, again, and again, when to your question about like the reader, right? Like, those are sometimes things I think about is like, but what if it was really a poem in which it's an offering of the sky to the reader, right? How would that shift how we connect, with each other and the world around us, perhaps? But again, it's an open question, and then I let people kind of explore that question in the way they might wander around the planisphere.
As a printed piece, this is beautiful. I mean, I worked in the print industry for a long time too, and to see something that intricate, it's amazing. I just love it. Kudos to you and to Boxcar Press for putting this out.
Oh my
So
God. Yeah. I mean, because as a designer, I work with so many vendors all the time and artisan studios. And when I was thinking about this poem, I was like, it needs to be in gold foil. Like, I don't care what it takes.
yeah.
I think I probably went through like several rounds of grant writing cycles, to like raise the money. And I talked to letterpress people. I'm like, who is the best
Mm.
studio that can pull off gold foil? Because I was like, I got really small type. I mean, we're not messing around here, like, and I was like, I really need this to be legible, but I also wanted it to be a handheld piece. And so, and everyone was like, oh yeah, boxcar. Yeah, for sure. And yeah, and it was really a pleasure, working with them because, they are so meticulous and detail oriented. And again, like, just as a designer, like you can tell like they really know who their clients are. And I was so like when I first opened it for the first time, I was like, oh, it's like whatever I was feeling, I was like, I really hope people really can enjoy it the way I am. So, again, it's just wanting to offer people like the absolute best experience you can give them is like that's such a reward for me.
Yeah. Yeah. This is a beautiful piece.
It
And
really is.
letterpress is like a dying art. Yeah, I'm amazed. So kudos.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to take a moment and have you read a poem from this new book, Planetaria. And both Wes and I, pre-podcast, thought it'd be nice if you read Lunar Volvelle.
Ah, yes. Yes, yes, yes. Um, this piece was also really, really fun to make, because it's made in the style of, these medieval volvelles, which are kind of also like charts that are like layered where you can align the date to the lunar day to find out like what part of the lunar phase of the moon you'd be at. And I think what was kind of fun about this is that in different parts of the lunar month, when the alignments shift, the verses then stack up differently,
Mm.
and you can also have, a range of combinations of verses. It's also possible that, some people might, kind of read it, kind of like horizontally, and others might read sections stacked as well. So again, it really invites a very open, kind of approach to the reading. And what I've always found is that when other people read my poems, I tend to like them better because because I think, again, we have our own tendencies, and it's always so fun to see how people might read something outside of my own tendencies, and I'm always like, gosh, it sounds even better, which is just to say, like, when people ask me like, oh, how am I supposed to read it? I always tell them the way you read it is probably more beautiful than I could imagine.
Mm.
So, okay, so I'm just gonna open up to that poem. So this is just one possible reading of Lunar Volvelle. Each name exhales. Water breaks like a spell of sky. A butterfly arch. Night's temple touching yours. Lung scar prayer. Unchurch his predation. O Savior sedation. Tenderness greens over the ruins of empire. We are stronghold. Someone is dying alone. Monster, my maiden name. A lava lace summit. Dusk lit by tear gas. We watch like moons. Shape of a woman who calls his bluff. Raging falls. The ones you call to gather in the margins. We dead awakening.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I love that it's so interactive that, like you said, depending on how you,
Mhm.
turn this and
Right.
interact with it, it's going to be different. And so that user experience is very unique to them. So
Yes. And it's like when you turn it to the full moon, you see a woman's face peering out from the full moon, and it's my father's mother watching over you.
Wow. Another great, I mean, design wise, great layout. I like everything about it, from the typography to the colors you chose and how it interplays. That the fact that you can move it is absolutely exquisite.
Thank you so much. It was so fun to put together. I think that's the thing too. It's like as a designer, look, I mean, when you design for other people, right? You also get told no a lot, right? They're like, "Oh, well, there's no budget." Or there's no timeline, there's not enough time, or sorry, we couldn't get that, vendor. Sorry, the stakeholder changed their mind, or sorry, the donor wants a different color. Sorry, so you're it's like, that's, and that's fine. I mean, that's part of, profession, and, that's life. And you show up and you just keep, you keep turning things in, right? But I think whenever I'm in my studio and I'm doing things for my own micropress, I'm always like, but nobody can tell me no.
Nice.
Like the only person that I think can really help put the brakes on things if needed would be like my husband. Like if he's just sort of like, well, like if he's just holding me accountable for some silly nonsense. Otherwise, it's kind of like, you know what? Yeah, I'm going to figure out how we're going to do this in gold foil and no one's going to tell me no.
Right.
It is so beautiful. Yeah. It's out of this world. Pun intended.
Thank you.
You set up this micropress. What was the thought behind that?
I think the micropress really, was about trying to find some kind of structure where I could bring all of me together, writer, designer, like visual, conceptual thinker, right? I wanted a place where I could really bring all of those things together to make the kind of work that I really envisioned, because I think, again, when you are coming out of school or early in profession, a lot of us are under the impression of like, well, in order for this to get accepted or in order for this to get published, I really should make it more like this, And so it was a way for me to like not strip my work down, right, to be more quote unquote digestible, right? Or to kind of make it fit into what already existed. What I was realizing very quickly over the years of just making what I make was that it was important not to dismantle my work to fit what was already out there, but instead build something that can actually hold the full breadth of what I'm actually making, And I think creating a way to, make, produce, and publish visual poetry in a way that's specifically in service to visual poetry, that was a gap I saw and something that I thought, well, look, I've been at it in design for quite a long time now. And, I've published like, kind of in a lot of sort of like journals. I published a first book kind of closer to like, maybe a more traditional way. So I've had enough time to kind of, like learn something, see how certain things are done. But really, like, I really wanted to craft, though, a vehicle where I could produce, visual poetry kind of exactly as I envisioned it, And so Proxima Vera allowed me to then bring the work to like book fairs, to institutional collections, and also like exhibit with the work. And and it really started getting its own legs, and so it was only natural that after some time I thought, I think I could really publish all this collection as a book as well. So I developed it into an artist imprint as well, because, I really also wanted to create the kind of publication that also really allowed the work to unfold for the reader, like, in its intended form, because I think, again, there are certainly templates about how, like, for example, writing should be published. There's certain rules for that, right? As well as how artist monographs are published. There's certain rules, right? Like, it's a chronological thing, it's done a certain way, right? And I knew that this collection, the way I was putting it together, again, it didn't quite fit into either or very neatly, and really kind of was asking for its own treatment, that I felt like I would rather just, again, like, be in service to what the work needs to be, and then structure the book in a way, like, I don't have like chapter numbers, right? Like in this, I have moon phases.
Right.
And again, I feel like, sure, like, that's not conventional, and people might be like, what is this? But I don't know, like, so far most of the people that have seen it are like, I really like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that really makes sense for this book.
Right.
But again, it's like, and I think it's about, like, kind of moving away from, like, these sort of conventional templates, and then really kind of thinking of visual poetry as something that has its own unique needs, and really catering to that. So I think, that's what I hope the micropress kind of opens up space for, so that, it is more possible to, like, make more of poems like these, right? Because again, if you say that's a poem, it's like, well, why not, right?
Right.
So yeah.
And you started Proxima Vera in 2021, is that right?
That's right. Yeah. Because again, I was making poetry broadsides that were kind of, again, like, it wasn't something that I was gonna just email a Word document to, like, get published, right? It was like very much like kind of closer to an artist print, and something that felt more of the exhibition space. And I think typically, like, I like this idea of making towards the exhibition space, because it challenges me to think about poetry in more formats and scales. And I always tell myself, I'll figure out how to turn it into a book later. But I feel like if I start from thinking more, like, spatially, that it'll allow me to really, like, like, kind of like stretch out a little bit more, like, what a poem can be. So I think, again, like, being able to produce and publish these in this way gave me a lot more flexibility, and the ability to make design decisions that I think felt more interesting to me.
And you've been working on this body of work for a little while now. At what point did you decide that, like, you had enough, or it was in the form that you wanted, that you're like, okay, now it's time to publish the book?
I usually will gauge that on, what the exhibitions look like, in the sense that, like, if I'm really filling, a series out in a way that feels like it's really explored a lot of the layers and a lot of the questions that I've had. But also, it's like, exhibitions for me, like, again, I work in series. So I did a series of constellation poems, and then I had a series of insomnia poems, and then I had a series of poems that were inspired by old astronomy textbooks. So there was a lot of these sort of like textbook pages, with these diagrams, and I saw these series kind of like growing, and then they were like really speaking to one another too. So I started feeling like, oh, there was a nice cohesion happening, and I think, after a while, it felt like, there was like almost, I don't want to say a sequence, but like there were definitely groupings, right, that like started to make sense together. And I would say, like, I probably started the writing for this almost like 10 years ago. So I take my time, but then also I felt like when this exhibition started traveling after a few years, I started to feel like, okay, you know what, like, this is kind of in a place now where I really wanted to make it more accessible to more people, because again, exhibitions are great because of that really wonderful, intimate, in-person experience, but also it's only accessible for those who come for that in-person experience. And so I started kind of feeling like, okay, I want to make sure I can share this with more people. And so that's when I started working on, developing it into a book so that people could really, like someone said to me, it was like the book feels like, in a way, like being able to like sneak into the gallery and spend a little bit of time with these. It felt like natural, like after the exhibition moved to the Hunterdon and after the Poetry Foundation, I felt like, okay, I felt also when you go to exhibition and you see people's connection to it, when you share tears with people in the gallery, like, you're on the right track. I think that's what, when you're like, okay, something's being stirred here. There's some resonance happening. And again, user experience designer, we call that like UX feedback, right? Like it's user testing, right? But again, it's all good learning and information, right? Because, if it was going out to exhibition or if I was doing readings and then there was nothing happening or it felt really flat, like then I would feel like, okay, there's some more work I need to do, right? I really felt like there was a lot of conversation and excitement and a lot of like really heartfelt connection that I was, like experiencing with people. And so I think after you gauge that, it's like instinctually, it's like you start feeling like, okay, I think we're ready and I think we can, start really transitioning this to book form. And so then, which is what I did during the last like year or so.
Yeah, it's absolutely beautiful,
Yeah.
Monica. It really is. I'm so excited to have this, just so you know.
Oh, thank you.
And that you were willing to share it with me. Last year in 2024, you were named a United States Artists Fellow, and I was not familiar with this particular thing. First of all, congratulations. That's fantastic. But talk a little bit about that and what that has done for you and the things that it has allowed you to do.
Well, yes, I mean, it is such an honor to be counted among, such incredible people, the other fellows. I remember like reading the list of fellows and like my mouth was just like dropping onto the table and being like, oh, wow, like, okay, because, they generously recognize, practitioners that they feel like make, really profound, contributions to the culture. Having, everything from like things like professional support, like, coaching to generous funding to help with the completion of projects has been really like life-changing, and I think, the endeavor of, working on turning the micropress to an imprint and, pivoting to saying, okay, let's see if I can produce this as a book. That was certainly much more possible with support. Let's just say, because, and because I manage all kinds of, design production projects at my job all the time, and I see how complicated and just like, expensive those things can get. And, it's one thing to write a manuscript that you send off to get published, but I think it's another thing to also say, I'm also going to be the art director and also the designer and also the publicist and also events manager. And, and in order to do that, it's like, there's a lot of learning. So I think, again, I've been so fortunate because, to have had the opportunity to work with like a coach and to work with people who really like are like cheerleading, supporting your growth, and being able to do this. And in seeing like the final piece that came out, I feel really proud, but also really appreciative, of, it takes a village, right? It takes a community. And in a way, I don't know if I would have dared myself to just do it like off the bat. I think, again, like as you can tell, like throughout the conversation, it's like I have a lot of curiosity, I have a lot of questions. I just feel like I end up with a lot of fortune of encountering really supportive people too, who sort of keep reminding me like, okay, like you can do this. My husband's been yelling at me about this for like years. He's like, you can totally do this. Stop waiting for permission.
Yeah.
Stop waiting for some Prince Charming situation to come and, like be a fairy god. He's like, you can do this, So I think it's been a really great journey. And, and I think, again, having the support of the United States Artists Foundation was like really incredible because they want to make it possible for artists to like bring projects to fruition, take things over the finish line. And, like I was in a place where I had made a lot of this work and I was like planning my steps to the finish line. And so it was just exactly kind of like the right alignment of timing where I was and where I was like trying to get to. So I'm just like really thrilled that the book will be coming out May 31st and I'll be pushing this over the finish line.
So did they provide the mentor for you or did you find a mentor for yourself?
They have different like networks of like mentors, like, and obviously I'm sure it probably depends on discipline or what have you. And so I was able to, kind of like partner with somebody who is just like really fantastic. And again, really kind of leveling up your sense of like, professionality of like, okay, what is it going to take to do something and how do you develop the mindset, right? To not only say like, yes, I can do it, but also like, here are the skills that I can acquire, or here are the things that I can really spend more time paying attention to in order to develop the kind of, like practice or workflows, to be able to like really implement.
Right.
Because again, like we all know, like just thinking about something doesn't make it so, right?
Right.
And so, and I think again, like sometimes, because, as artists, we're stirring so many pots at once. And I think being able to have conversation that helps focus you a little bit on maybe specific things that you can spend more time with, like kind of building up just to help move things to the next step. I think that's always super helpful. And I think just, again, like mentorship is always, it's just something where I'm so grateful to receive it, but also it makes me feel really deeply committed that like, to be able to pass it forward to, pay it forward for other people. So, and that mentorship is such an important currency, like, as part of keeping creative community going,
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. We're going to start to wrap this up, but I want you to talk about, do you have any exhibitions coming up? Do you have any special events? I know you have some speaking engagements coming up, some poetry readings. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I am really excited that in New Haven, there will be a really wonderful New Haven book launch at Possible Futures. And that's going to be happening on Friday, June 6th. I'll also be kind of doing appearances around the East Coast as well. So there'll be a poetry reading at Riff Raff in Providence, Rhode Island, July 27th. I'll also be in New York City at You and Me Books on Thursday, August 14th. There'll also be some like virtual readings because I know, some folks might be, geographically in other spaces. So I'll be actually reading in the Phosphorescence Contemporary Poetry Series hosted by the Emily Dickinson Museum. That reading's on August 21st. And I'm like super excited about it because the lineup is so stellar and it's the Emily Dickinson Museum. So that's pretty awesome. There's also a whole bunch of other dates in the works right now. So if people visit monicaong.com/events, you'll see all the new dates getting added. I mean, they're all like literally going to be added like in the next, coming months. So, and I do plan to visit the Midwest in the fall and also Charlottesville, Virginia in October. So again, just check back, and people can also visit proximavera.com to sign up for my newsletter, which will also, just let people know like what's coming up and cool projects I've been doing and am working on. And also I like to share with people like what kinds of, visual art or literary influences or inspirations I'm looking at as well. So especially if people are interested in visual poetry or image and text alchemies, I often talk a lot about, just process and ideas there too.
Fantastic. Yeah. And they can also purchase Planetaria and your first book through your website, Silent Anatomies. That's correct?
So Planetaria you can purchase at proximavera.com as well as on, online booksellers. So like bookshop.org, Amazon too, as much as possible. If you can buy direct from the publisher, that's what supports artists most directly. And Silent Anatomies you can find at Corey Press, who published it in 2015. So I think they're at coreypress.org. And it's also available on online booksellers as well. So yeah, you should be able to easily find both titles. Yeah, it's super exciting.
Fantastic. Well, before we leave off tonight, I'm going to ask that you read one more poem. And in each one of the phases, you have one of these insomnia poems. Mm-hmm. And I asked you earlier, pre-podcast, if you wouldn't mind reading one of those for us.
All right, sure. I think what I'll do is share. I feel like this is a fitting one, given our conversation this evening. This is Jade Insomnia, and it features two charts in it. One with my mother's mother in the first chart, and then my father's mother in the second chart. So both of my grandmothers, watching over us as I read this poem. Jade Insomnia. Your mother's mother was named for precious jade. Your father's mother for healing jade. Between them is my night's long palm stretching from 1 hour into 10, pressing your eyes open. Two chalices still hoping to catch stars under a sky heavy with other people's dreams. Jade Insomnia is the jungle river whose unrest swells beneath the sternum, hidden at the bottom of each interrupted breath. Shame's night traffic collides with each of your faults, glistens wet, blinking in the aftermath. In the sprite moss of this moment, your fingers touch down on the earth. Mother of witness, please grant me a home beneath these feet. Poets are selenologists learning to read craters of loss. The graveyard silence is flooded by mantras wrangling moisture from distant moon rock. Jade Insomnia is your third eye opening, noticing a little too much, unable to fathom how close I really am. Trees gather at your window upon the start of another letter that may never arrive. It is the color of disillusionment, how you've been chasing green lights all these years. Alone in a deserted office, you are a bridge to the future of this place, they say, leaving a dustpan with your name on it as they push their lifeboats off the littered shore off your spine. They take what they want and leave. What else did you expect? Jade Insomnia is a losing battle, and yet you decide to stay with me. I watch you glow into luciferin sage, quietly plotting your escape behind doors in empty stairwells. Try to leave you clues inside envelopes and the lure of kind hazel eyes. I meet you in parking lots, on the page, am waiting outside your overthinking mind, my linden breeze cool against your skin. Sometimes I am an unseen hand bending the light a little closer to you. Once I came as a stranger into the gallery, and when we saw each other, we cried. These days I'm fashioning myself a soft baritone voice to whisper your name into all the right ears. Unlike Yunyu, I don't walk your dreams in elegant veils, make miracles, or even care to save you, because here's the thing. You already do it so well on your own. Remember the difference between the jade of your lineage and the kind that turns me away. Tell me you'll come for me. I admit that I am slow, but definitely worth the fight.
Wow. That was amazing. I love those. And I
Fantastic.
love the images that go with it. I mean, fantastic. Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you. In that poem, it was me having a conversation with my dream, and I think my grandmother's like watching the conversation, because I think a lot of artists, they go through that battle. It's like, oh, should I keep going? Like,
Right.
is it worth it? Like, like you're battling, right? But again, I think, my ancestors are always nearby, and they're watching and I feel like they're looking and saying, we know you're going to make the right choice.
Nice. I love that. That's amazing.
Monica, thank you so much. We so appreciate your time, taking time away from your family, from your work, whatever else you might have had going on this evening. But what we always say here at Tenet is that time is the most precious thing that we have. So the fact that you are willing to spend time with us, we just sincerely appreciate it. And we love your work and what you do.
Yeah, and I'm really
Likewise.
looking forward to following your progression and see what comes next, and also, watch you do what you're doing in this instance, and that's going to be exciting. So, thank you
Yeah.
so much for doing this.
Absolutely. And I just want to say thanks to both of you too for holding space, for me, but like all these incredible artists that you speak to. And again, like, channeling time and attention towards the arts, I think is so precious, and we know how precious that is. So I'm also like profoundly grateful to both of your efforts as well. And I had so much fun in this conversation. I think this is one of the funnest conversations I've been able to do. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Again, don't forget to follow Monica on Instagram at Proxima Vera and check out Monica's visual poetry and stunning work at her website, monicaong.com, where you can also pre-order her wonderful new book, Planetaria. As always, I will have this and more in this week's episode notes. For the Tenet Podcast, I'm Todd Pearson.
And I'm Wes Brown.
Have a great week.